Good evening, everyone. My name is MJ, and I'm part of the Migrant Justice Initiative project at Yale University. I am so excited that you joined us for today's book conversation between author Karla Cornejo Villavicencio and Professor Albert Laguna. Before we introduce each other, we'd like to acknowledge the stolen Quinnipiac land on which Yale University stands, as well as the indigenous peoples and nations that have historically cared for and maintained the land which we now call Connecticut, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chattahoochee, Golden Hill Pagaset, Neantic, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples. A little bit about the Migrants Justice Initiative. We are a multidisciplinary project at the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration that aims to establish relationships between scholars and migrant-led social justice campaigns. Our goal is to engage in discussions of agency, mobility, displacement, politics, and culture from the perspective of migrants in order to better understand their realities and the structures that shape them. Our team currently includes Alicia, Katy Maldonado, Ramon, Maggie Katz, and MJ, myself. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator and our speaker for today. I'd like to begin with Professor Albert Sergio Laguna. He's an associate professor of ethnicity, race, and migration and American studies at Yale University. His research and teaching interests include transnational Latinx literatures and cultures, comparative ethnic studies, performance studies, and popular culture studies. His work has appeared and is forthcoming in Latino Studies, the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, Latin American Research Review, Contemporary Literature, Cultural Critique, Diario de Cuba, the Miami Herald, the Washington Post, and on CNN.com. Laguna's first book, Diversión, Play in Popular Culture in Cuban America, won numerous awards, including the 2018 Peter C. Rollins Book Prize from the Northeast Popular American Culture Association. An article from his current book project, Edgardo Vega Yunque and the Comedy of Race, was awarded the L.S. Dembo Prize for Contemporary Literature for Best Article published in that journal in 2018. And then we have author Karla Cornejo Villavicencio, who is an immigrant from Brooklyn and Queens, Harvard graduate, Yale PhD student, and a writer who has contributed to the New York Times, the New Republic, Vogue, Elle, Glamour, This American Life, and more. She is the author of the National Book Award finalist, The Undocumented Americans, a book of essays, and the upcoming young adult novel, Dream Girl. She lives in New Haven with her partner and her very cute dog. And now I'd like to pass it over to Professor Laguna, who will be moderating the panel.
Hello, everyone. I'd ask you how you're all doing. You can maybe tell me in the chat if you'd like. Karla, more importantly, how are you doing?
I am okay. Hello.
Good to see you. Good to see you. We had a little a Frankie cameo there before the talk, so I'm excited to have the whole kind of crew there along with you. So Karla, a lot of people on this call, I'm sure, have read this book, but others have not. So I thought we could start with just a really basic, you bringing us into the world of the undocumented Americans. Why did you write this book, and what is it about? What are you trying to do with it?
I wrote this book as a response to having grown up with representations of immigrants that I didn't feel were true to my community or my family growing up. And I wrote it, I began researching and writing it the morning after Trump won the presidency in 2016. So it's very much like a snapshot in time. And I wanted to do something different with genre. I'd always, ever since you're like in high school, one of the basic things you learn in like English class is that like after like the A-bomb or after something like a world war, there was like a change in schools of literature. And I felt that I didn't want to wait around to see what would happen, what would result of the Trump presidency. Like when I was a child when 9/11 happened, and I remember people were wondering like, what would the 9/11 novel look like, right? And I don't think they've been great, but I do remember having a sense that obviously things would be bad for immigrants during the Trump administration, but also having a sense of what those like literary works would look like and wanting to provide an alternative.
So, I mean, you're providing an alternative to, I guess, what you imagine the kind of fallout has been of the Trump presidency, the narratives around undocumented folks, but you're also providing an important kind of intervention in representations of the undocumented immigrants more broadly, I think, in mainstream discourse. You have this great line, which reminds me, I don't need much of a reminder how funny you are in this book, right? There's some moments of really great lines, cutting comic lines. But you say, quote, you didn't want this book to be a rueful tale about a sickly Victorian orphan with tuberculosis who didn't have a social security number. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about maybe like the biz side of this, right? How the publishing industry in particular sells the narrative of Latinx folks, undocumented immigrants more broadly, first, second generation, how you see the book in conversation with those demands. And also, if you could just say a little bit about, now that the book has received a lot of positive attention, you know, what that experience has been within the industry as you continue to kind of gain that visibility.
I mean, can I just say, I don't know who's on the call because of the way this is set up. So I'm feeling triggered right now because I don't know how many of the people here know Albert was one of my dissertation advisors, and before then, one of my professors. And he's known me since I was like 21 or 22. And even though on Instagram I say I'm 26, I'm 31. And so, so your tone, your teaching tone to me is very, it just brings me back to when I was like 23 and crying in your office, which I think in a lot of author talks that doesn't happen. So I'm going to try to answer your questions without crying.
Clarify first that, so I don't get hate mail, that it wasn't because I was mean to you that you're crying, but because we were having difficult conversations, or maybe I was mean to you. You can clarify.
No, because he's a mentor. And so it was like a mix of academic queries and sharing texts, and this would be inspirational to you, and you might want to look at this resource. Let's do outlines. I always benefit from outlines. And also just like, my 20s were a time were a decade-long fugue state, and Albert was there for it. So if there are any National Enquirer is here, Albert is willing to tell it all. So what was your question?
What was the question? Yes. I'm interested in the biz, right? Because we've talked about this a lot, the publishing industry, kind of the narratives they like to publish about Latinx communities, undocumented and not undocumented, and just to hear a little bit of how this book is pushing back in conversation with those demands. And also, you know, because this book has received a National Book Award, right? I mean, it's getting a lot of attention, and it's taking you probably into conversations that you haven't had before in the industry. I'd like to hear just, you know, your experience with that.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting. I received pushback at every single step of trying to write this book and publishing it and promoting it. You know, not from, there's some stuff that I can't say because I'd like to continue to make a living throughout my life in publishing. But the original draft of my book was at another imprint that has now closed, and they rejected the book because they called it broken and unpublishable, and it's this book. And I asked why, and I wasn't given a reason. I was told that I was going to be given a letter explaining everything, and I wasn't. I was just given the line edits, and the line edits were typical edits that were like, you might want to move this clause here. And so I won't reveal what happened later, but my editor protected my book, and it ended up in the hands of Christopher Jackson, who was an extraordinary editor at One World, who edits Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram X. Kendi and Kiara Udes, and he really understood my voice, but it took him a lot of time to understand me, you know, and to understand that there could be someone like me, a dreamer like me, who had different kinds of loyalties, you know. And so while he supported my vision, he was a little bit confused by it, and probably had to do with me having a difficulty articulating my vision. But so, you know, for instance, the magical realism that's in the book, he thought that was going to make people not believe in the reporting in the book. And some of the reporting is reporting that I break. So like the stories of the 9/11 cleanup workers has been pretty underreported. And he's like, people are not going to believe that if you're just like, you're making things up. And like I was telling you earlier, Albert, I thought Elian Gonzalez was rescued by the dolphins. And I listened to a podcast recently where they were talking about Elian, and they were like, you know, these people thought that he was rescued by the dolphins. And I was talking to my partner, who is a white woman, and I was like, I mean, I thought that until I listened to the podcast. Like, I knew that wasn't literally real, but it is a kind of real. I mean, in the sense that if a group of people, a large enough group of people believe it, and if their belief leads to a conclusion that sustains them, then it is real. I mean, it's a kind of real. It's a kind of real that that has actual material consequences in people's lives, right? And so the way I think about magical realism is super specific, and so I explained it, and what we ended up doing in the book is every instance of magical realism ended up being a dream, you know. But you know, for copy editors, I received a lot of support in my imprint from my editor, but you know, copy editors, proofreaders would circle paragraphs in my book and say, "Are you sure you want to say this? This is vulgar." Or are you sure you want to say this? This is you know, this is really violent. Or I don't think you want to publish something that says this. Where I was like revealing that I was cruel to my brother, or where I was revealing something dark but funny, like a fantasy that I had about drowning a toddler, which was not real, but it was. It still revealed something about my psyche. And so I just had to, I don't know if college students do this, but when you're in editing, you just do stet if you want to reject an edit. And I was just, I take edits. But when they're about tone that people think that I shouldn't be using, because as an immigrant, I am not entitled to that tone, I just wrote stet a lot. And then when it came up to promoting the book, you know, the thing they wanted to lead with was that I was a Harvard grad, one of the first Harvard grads to go from, you know, and I was like, that doesn't position my book as a literary book. That positions it as a dreamer memoir, which is not. I don't talk about Harvard. I don't talk about Yale. I don't talk about any of that. Like, it's, I understood why they had to do it, but then I had to work behind the scenes to sabotage the marketing plans and to reach out to individual people, individual editors, individual publications, and say, this is a literary book.
I have a ton of questions about the literary aspect of this book that I want to talk about, but I do want to put some more of the focus on the kind of nuts and bolts. And here I have a question about just translation, you know, because I was reading this book as the second time around as a literary work, trying to understand the different devices at work. And just one word that kept coming up in my head was translation. right? And your comments right now make me think of translation again, right? How it works as a concept in the book. You talk about your beef with translation in the context of journalists and often how they fail to convey the complexity of the language of their Spanish speaking interlocutors. You talk about translation in the context of someone like Santiago at the Worker Center who refuses to translate a pastor's sunny liberal takes on America. Then there's your own approach to translating the words of the folks you engage with, right? And translating your vision for a broader readership. So, and then I also want you to talk about the question of translating this book into Spanish, and how that's going, if it's going, and what your thoughts are about it. So if you could riff a little bit about translation as a kind of concept in this book and your relationship to it, I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I first became acquainted with translation as a narrative that white audiences like to hear immigrant children talk about, or children of immigrants talk about, like vis-a-vis our relationship to our parents. Like, we translate for our parents. That makes us special. And that makes us worthy of a special kind of pity, but also a special kind of attention. And I'd like to poll all, children of immigrants who've applied to schools using translation as part of their college entrance essay. I did. I mean, I didn't write about being undocumented, but I wrote a short story, which I wasn't allowed to do, where I focused on translation and also about lying through translation. And then it, dawned on me, now that I'm 31 and I'm working on my healing, that translation from the time that you're very young, from the time that you're 5 years old, and not just basic translation, but like writing your own absence notes, translating for your report cards, translating at your own therapist appointments, translating at your mother's gynecological appointments where you may hear things about your dad that you rather not know. That's all part of like this parentification thing that children of immigrants go through, which is not our parents' fault. It is part of the system that we've fallen into. That is this monster of migration. And it is not blaming anyone to acknowledge that migration, where the powers that are supposed to protect us and create laws to guarantee that we have humane and dignified lives, have neglected us. And so that we, the children, often have to become parent figures to our parents. And so translation is very fraught. And it's not the romantic, sweet thing that white admissions officers think it is. And so, yeah, translation was interesting to me in the book. And it was interesting to me as a writer, because whenever I read pieces of journalism that have literally transliterated English to English, there's no art in the translation. And so they just use one word for one word, and they make us all sound like we have a kindergarten level language capability with absolute no nuance and absolute no sense of humor, absolute no sense of interiority. And I'm like, that's not how we sound like, because when you read us in the Spanish paper, when you read us in El Diario, we're shady, we're sassy, we have conspiracy theories. Why don't we sound like that in the English paper? And so my approach to translating in this book was, well, as a child of immigrants, my thing is translating, right? So I translated for my subjects the way that I did for my parents. So in real time, and when it was time for me to, and I didn't use recorders because this was 2016 and I did not want to scare people. As Edith Grossman, who translated for Garcia Marquez and stuff, who translated for Garcia Marquez and stuff, Vargas Llosa, you have a certain number of words that you could use to translate. Why choose the simplest word to make you sound like what you think we are, which is the simplest possible common person when you have these other words that you could translate. So because I'm not an actual translator or an actual journalist, I chose a word that conveyed what I thought the person meant, felt like, if they were angry, and the sort of like the spirit of the person. I got to know my subjects really well. And so when you see their text in my book, it sounds like you're talking to someone that you know in your language. And I didn't make any text up. I didn't make any dialogue up. It's their words. I just translated the way that a poet would translate, literary language, which is you do some rewriting, but you don't add. You just choose the most beautiful or the most evocative choices, which I thought was a way of giving back some dignity to our community, which has been infantilized. And another thing, yes, my translation. So my book was written in English. My maternal language is Spanish, but the language I write in and think in is English. And I don't know if I can talk about this, but whatever. So like my book was going to be translated into Spanish. And they hired a Latin American, a white Latin American translator for the Spanish translation. So I spoke to this person and I said, my book has my philosophy on translating. And she said, I don't agree. And I said, okay, you do you, boo. But like, this is a very clear voice in my book. Like it's very voicey. And also my readers are going to be like immigrants and people connected to immigrants. Like I'm from New York, and so I got the translation back, and it's in this like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, aristocratic Spanish. Okay, so I'm at the Yale American Studies PhD program. I applied to 2 American Studies PhD programs in English, Harvard and Yale. Everything else I applied for was Spanish PhD programs or Latin American PhD programs in Spanish. Like, I get it. I got it. She thought it was, the editor thought it was a class thing. He told me like, we can try to get this to sound more like street Spanish. And I was like, excuse me, sir, do you know that Latinx Spanish is a different vernacular than Latin American aristocratic Spanish, sir? And then it just wasn't worth my time because, like I said, I'm on a healing journey and I just don't waste that energy. Like Shakira says in that song, you don't throw pearls to the pigs, I was not going to change his mind. My editor tried to speak on my behalf and say, Karla's right, like you have to get a different translator. You know what he said to me? The typical response of racist white men who say that there are no qualified candidates. He said that he couldn't find a Latinx translator, a qualified Latinx translator. And I said, CUNY has a program for translation. And then he was difficult about it and he said no. So I pulled the translation. And I just knew the book was going to continue to be more successful and I was going to win more awards and I was going to have my choice of translator at some point. Because like, what's the point of publishing a book that's going to sound like an Argentine on ecstasy masturbating to himself? This book is written by and for Latino immigrants and immigrant adjacents. If it's not going to sound like that, then it doesn't exist.
Okay, I think we have the title of your next book there, our next hard-hitting article about the reception of this book. And this it's actually really interesting to hear that, right? Because it gives you a sense of, when you think of how a book like yours makes it through the world of the U.S. publishing industry, you ever think about the kind of translation to Spanish aspect of it? I think that's very telling and perhaps not too surprising. I really appreciate that riff on translation, and it really just hits home like how well you do the job of translation, because the measure for me for that is that I remember the people distinctly that you talk about and you're speaking with in your book, right? It's not just like a mass of people, right, with different stories. I remember names and like situations, and that's because you're giving us a person through their words, right? And that's because of your skill as a translator, right? So, I want to illuminate that a bit more, your relationships with these people, because it's such a big part of the book. It's what makes the book, right? So I'd love for you to say a bit more about how you made those connections, develop that intimacy, but I'm more interested secretly, not so secretly, in the failures of connection that you talk about. You talk about it in a couple different ways, right? And I think it's really important you don't shy away from the fact that you failed multiple times, right, to connect with people, right? And I think those failures are, dare I say, generative, right? So I'd love to hear more about that, the relationships you cultivated and you couldn't cultivate, right? I think that's an important part of the story.
Which relationships are you speaking about?
Well, I always think about the when you're in, is it Cleveland Flint, when the students, you're like, let's go to New York. They're just kind of like looked at you, and the trouble you had connecting with some of the teenagers, preteens, Flint context. But I mean, you bring a lot of commonalities and kind of common ground with these people to connect with, but there are also big differences, right? Of your life trajectory and the people you're speaking with. So, yeah, I'd love to hear about those relationships, because they are core, right, to the book.
So the Flint chapter was very painful for me to write, because it's something that is unresolved within me. And I know, again, I have no idea who's on this call other than Alicia's face and Steve's big S on the screen. But I know a lot of you, Latinx youth who are here at Yale might be able to relate to this. But when you've heard from from your earliest memories that the way of getting out is through education, and it just happens through strokes of luck and genetic accidents that you have no control over, and work ethic. But you also know that your uncle has incredible work ethic, and your undocumented aunt has great work ethic, and your cousin that works at Walmart has great ethic. And then you're like, well, it's not just work ethic, right? And you understand that it's just kind of Russian roulette. And you're like, okay, so I did this the right way. And then as you grow older, you realize that it changes a lot of things and it doesn't change a lot of things. So, so some right-wing websites try to take me on and be like, the way to fame and fortune is to be an illegal alien. And it's like, well, I'm a queer icon now, but I definitely don't have no fortune. And it's, I know that college is not the answer for everybody, but I also have a knee-jerk reaction if a young person comes up to me and asks for advice, to say, go to four-year school. I can't not. And if a young person says that they want to do something in art, I need to know what their art looks like. And I need to personally evaluate if I think that they are going to be able to make money off of it. And if I don't think they are, I will break their fucking heart and say, I think you can do this as a hobby, but I think you should go into engineering, And a lot of people, including my partner, think I'm a monster. She teaches in education studies. And so, she has a lot of kids of color who want to be teachers. And sometimes I get them on the sly and I'm like, hey, have you thought about law school? And it's just because I know a lot of these kids have to support their parents until they die. And I worry about how they're going to be able to do that on a public school teacher salary, on an elementary school public teacher salary. And it's not my business, but I also just worry. And I haven't solved it for myself because I took an arts career. I'm doing okay in terms of recognition laurels, but I'm not making money off of it. But I've also been lucky enough to support my parents throughout the pandemic. And that's it. I sort of feel like that is, like the J-Lo movie Enough, where she was just like, does all of the like, all of the like the physical, like all of the training to get ready to beat her abuser. I was like, I did all of this to be able to support my parents because I knew a pandemic was coming and they needed to live off of me because otherwise they would literally die. And I want all of these children of immigrants who come to me asking for advice or who don't, I want them to be able to have that. At the same time, I don't want them to be unhappy and choose careers that kill their souls. And so that's the Flint chapter, where I try to reach out to young teens and say, like, look at me, don't you have big Broadway dreams? And they're like, no, I mean, I want to just, that place has great tips and they probably make more money than I do. But then I'm like really heavy handed and I'm like, have you thought about health insurance? Have you thought about savings? And I just can't help but be that person because of my traumas. And I thought that the most honest way to handle that, instead of somehow pretending that I've solved that for myself, is just being totally, like we say in Spanish, a calzón quitado. Just being like, look, I'm a product of programs like Prep for Prep. And I'm a product of knowing that I went hungry as a child and that I had this one thing that I was good at that it turns out I can make money from. And now it's sort of like I remember Kendrick Lamar saying in an interview that what he does now is that he hires a lot of talented kids from Compton to work for him. And I don't know how that's going, but he says that like the first time that he was at a nice hotel, he wished that he could just like fly in all the kids from Compton and just put them in that one hotel. And I think it's a lot of survivor's guilt. And I think it's a lot of hoping that the magic spell that worked for you, even a little, worked for everybody else. And I think a lot of people struggle with it. And I think that no one wants an answer, but acknowledging the struggle is what a lot of people needed.
I think, it's important for you to say that, and say it out loud. My next question was going to be about that tension between the password for the kids in outside of Cleveland, right? Study hard, and your anxieties about giving that kind of the advice about education. But I think it's important to hear, because so much of the story is follow your dreams, do what you love. But for a lot of people, they can't, or it's not that easy to make that decision. So to show that you're wrestling with it, I think is in the book is really important, productive. I want to move now, looking at the clock, to the question of this book as capital L literature, right? And art, right? Because I think that's such an important part of this book, a contribution that it's making, is that it will be the subject of many English PhD dissertations.
There's not enough there.
Oh yeah, don't worry, it's all right. I'm already starting to assign it. So it's the pipeline, we're working on that pipeline. Someone has to be the Karla Cornejo Villavicencio Chair of American Studies somewhere.
Oh God, please don't. I'll send a cease and desist.
Well, I think I just want to take a line from your intro, right? And I want to ask you to unpack it a bit, right? Where you say, quote, "When you're an undocumented immigrant with an undocumented family, writing about undocumented immigrants, and I can only speak for myself and my ghosts, it feels unethical to put on the drag of a journalist. It is also painful to focus on the art, but impossible to process the world as anything but art," end quote. So I just want you to just unpack, what does it mean to process this world that you're writing about as art? Why is that important? And if you can clarify even what's the creative in creative nonfiction, right, that you're kind of harnessing in this narrative?
Well, I mean, for me, it was important to, studied under Kate Dudley at Yale, and so I had an understanding of like ethnographic writing and even like ethnographic creative writing and ethnographic fiction. But so I referred to my subjects as my subjects, but I also, while I was writing my book, I made a conscious decision to write about them as characters because I wanted them to be like really rich people who, you know, had weight. And so it's sort of like when you build a character from scratch, and now that I'm writing a novel, it feels harder to do with a novel. But I wrote them as characters. I wanted them to hold up to scrutiny. And in order to do that, I had to do a lot of interviews where I just didn't ask them, how many times did you cross the desert? Do you send remissions to your family? Like, what does it mean to be American? That's not how you write a character, right? That's how you sort of fill out a census form. So what I did was I just talked to them about just really boring things, and just like not a lot happens in my book. There's not really much plot. Like one of the stories that people seem to respond to a lot, and one of the loveliest conversations I had was with, I forget the name I give him in the book because I changed everyone's names, but a man in the Flint chapter who worked at a chocolate factory and who had 2 pit bulls. And that's all I say about him, really. He worked at a chocolate factory and then he got fired, and he gave his filtered water to his 2 pit bulls. And usually in a story where you have like in a piece of art about immigrants, you want like a story. You want there to be trauma, you want there to be action, you want there to be, but nothing happens here. It's just that. But the way that I was able to write about him in sort of like a slow sort of pace that people really responded to was that I sort of built him up like a paper doll. And I cared about him. And I think you can tell that when you read the book. And I thought what made him so special was that people think about us as people who will do jobs Americans won't do. We're just like really hard workers or like whatever. But here's a man who took like great delight and great dignity in having this really, this job that he loved with these fantastic smells, and where at the end they thought that they could infantilize him by giving him a certificate that was like, you did great, bud, when they fired him for no reason. And the fact that when people think of undocumented immigrants, they're not going to think that someone loved his rescue pit bull so much that they would give them their own filtered water during a water crisis. No one's going to think that, that is such a beautiful humanizing detail. And I thought that says so much. That says so much. And yeah, so it was things like that I think really build up a character. So for me, it wasn't about representing subjects, because representing subjects for me, I think could be just like, you already have in your mind what you want to say about them, like hardworking, family values, pays his taxes, whatever. But I wanted to see what made that person special. And everything, there's good special, bad special, weird special, but every person has a little something. And so I just treated people as characters, and I think that's what made it creative.
Yeah, I think, when you're talking about the smells, since you began talking about this person, I was instantly transported to kind of sensory experience of reading that text. I can almost smell the floor of the candy factory, right? So again, effective, and I'm kind of, I want candy now. So if I can ask you to go a little bit more on this question of creativity, right? I want to ask you about the moment that people always ask you about, right? The way you imagine the death of Ubaldo Cruz Martinez, right? Because I'm particularly attracted to where you say on after you relate his story after drowning in a basement with Hurricane Sandy, you say, what if this is how, in the face of so much sacrilege and slander, we reclaim our dead? It's the question of imagination and art, is how I'm kind of filling in the kind of connecting the dots here. So can you say a little bit about that moment? Because it is such a, I think, key moment for unpacking the way kind of creativity is working in this text, and how you think the work of creativity, why you think it's important.
You know, he was, his is the only occasion in the book where I use someone's real name. I use pseudonyms for everyone except for him. All of the day laborers that I knew, and I became very close to the day laborers in Staten Island, most of them knew him or knew of him. And when I talked to them about him, there was a sense of slight, I guess there was a lot of sadness, but slight embarrassment because of the way he died. And what was originally in the book, and I cut out, was, for no reason other than space or just editing, was that if I died right now, if I was just like a freak accident, slipped and hit my head, because of who I am, which is just like a loud spoken person who is unapologetic about being undocumented. An autopsy, or, you know, the results of that would probably be made political. And what it would reveal is like up for literary interpretation. You know, I'm on a lot of medications in order to keep me alive. And given the day, given how hard things are, given how unstable or kind or unboundaried my parents are, given the political news of the day, like, aside from the medications I'm on, which laymen don't have understanding of, like, and some of those medications are scary sounding, like antipsychotics, right? They don't know what they're treating. They're used off-label to treat my borderline personality disorder. But there's also, you know, I might have a benzodiazepine in my system. I might have taken a drink. I might have had a lot of kombucha, which might represent for some level of alcohol. You know, I might have taken a beta blocker because that stops my panic attacks because it slows down my heart rate. You know, it might have been a day where I had a really big deadline that night and I might have taken an Adderall. And if someone did a toxicology report, they would have said, like, look at your little dreamer, you know, look at all the substances she's on. And nobody deserves to have a toxicology report or any phase in their life define who they are or what their journey in this country has been like. Because, like, Albert, you know me, like, I'm doing okay now, but there have been times in my 20s and during Yale where I was not doing okay and I did not handle my mental health issues well, and my mental health issues were intimately tied to my migration and the fact that I did not know they were tied to my migration. And I was sort of walking around blindly. And I did not receive culturally sensitive mental health treatment for them. And I was, you know, I fell asleep in coffee shops. I passed out in places. I like vomited blood outside of lecture halls. What if like that had been the moment where I had become public and that had been the name people remembered me by? So once you have that in your head, you understand that migration affects us all, as we are all migrants, in the sense that we are all migrants. And I didn't think it was fair that that was his death, because a lot of people drink during storms. He died, he was drinking during the hurricane. A lot of people drink during storms, and it just happened that he died. so I thought that as someone who has total power over what I put on the page, I could either report it the way that newspapers reported it, which was this alcoholic day laborer drowned because he was, because of vice, or because of the understanding that I had about the life that migration takes on a body and on a mind and a soul. I could envision a different ending for him. And it was a reclamation. And I felt that that reclamation was for him personally, because my heart dictated I make it, but it was also for me. It was also a reclamation for the different people I have been in my life, and the kind of political piñata I could have been at different points in my life, or could still be, It was, in the end, it was an artistic call for compassion and empathy, and also a reminder to my less than sympathetic readers that so long as they are holding my pages, I am God and I control what happens in this book.
That's really great. That, now I'm going to read that scene with a new set of eyes. I really appreciate that that explanation, and also just that moment in the book, just it's pushing back against so much of even the literature in Latinx studies or mainstream discourse, which is, we try to count the undocumented. It's about policies. It's about it's about labor, right? So like making a space for art and the imagination, I think is so important. It's just what I love about this book so much. I have some, let's see what time it is, 5:50. This is kind of it's kind of a me question. I just really want to know. Writing this book was clearly not easy. So I'm really curious, just because I want to get in your head a little bit here about what you were listening to and reading while you were working through this. I'm very curious.
At the beginning, I read a lot of James Baldwin to muster up the courage to write this, because I love his writing, obviously, but I also knew that he had a reluctance to write about some of the things he did because it affected him immensely, and he felt that it was an obligation to give back, as he said, to the people who made him, to the people who he owed. And so I read a lot of him. And then I mostly stopped reading. I read some Jenny Diskey because I liked her voice, but I read a lot of Eileen Miles, who became a friend, and I love Eileen's voice. And there's sort of nobody's books who I read and then go, I really want to write now, other than Eileen. But mostly I listen to a lot of music, and I think you can sort of tell with the cadence of my sentences that I was going for something that was kind of disjointed and chaotic, but also really tightly controlled, something that was like written and then played chaotically. And so I listened to a lot of like the White Stripes, and I listened to a lot of Fiona Apple. And I listened to a lot of Nirvana and the Arctic Monkeys. And it's so funny, the Arctic Monkeys have the songwriter Alex Turner, he writes some really weird lyrics that if I try to write would totally get edited out. But if I can say is that like everything that I tried to edit out, everything that anyone tried to edit out of this book, any sentence, and that I fought for, have now become my readers' favorite sentences or passages. So
that's, now I have a soundtrack for when I reread the book. I appreciate that. I'm taking notes here. So maybe 2 or 3 more questions before we open up to the Q&A. I'm gonna ask you, kind of fiendishly, to go back to your TF days, right? I'm curious about how would you teach this book? Or if you don't want to answer that question, maybe the question is, what do you want readers in college maybe to get out of this book? But if you want to put on the TF hat, you're more than welcome to do that.
like, I have no recollection of my time as a TF. And sometimes like students, I mean, they've graduated, but like they would have been like, hey, and I'd be like, hey, I did not remember any of them. I want, you know what's crazy? I have gotten a lot of messages from young people, college students who are saying that they are comfortable experimenting with the essay form and with first person writing, and like that's based on heavy research and interviews, and that their professors are actually encouraging them to do creative projects and personal essays based on a lot of interviews and reportage and research. And all of these kids who write me are kids of color. And I think that that's fantastic. I have like throughout high school until now, I have forced that to be the case for me in all of my classes. But the fact that I think, I have a friend who's an immigration journalist, and she just got her first book deal. And she said that her editor told her, like, cited my book and said that she was allowed to write in the first person, which before, as a journalist, you were not allowed to do. And so I think that even though my book is still not like huge, it's been really a grassroots support of a lot of Latinx people and a lot of immigrants and children of immigrants and people of color who supported the book. I think that a lot of people who are assigning the book or in the publishing industry have, I don't know why it took them so long, but have noticed that this is something you can do and are validating the genre of the personal essay that's based on reporting and interviews and, pop culture references and all of this genre that I worked with. And they, it's kind of like when Dave Eggers released A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, and there were like a lot of Dave Eggerses after that, I was one of them.
So in the future, when I teach your book, I'll send you my students' comments and reader responses, so you can be in the kind of room as a TF, right? But you mentioned a little bit about the response that the book has received, your direct messages about students feeling an ability to experiment with form and genre. Can you say a little bit more about that grassroots support and the responses from folks you're getting?
Yeah, I mean, at first I was the only one who bet on this book. Like, nobody believed in this book. My editor loved my voice, but I don't think he understood that this book was as special as it was. It was entirely Latinx readers on social media who discovered this book, and not just like young people in their colleges, but it was like from college age to like children, like older, much older children of like the original braceros, who were like, I've been waiting my entire life to see a book like this, who were really emotional and would like send me videos of them unboxing my book. And then like the younger kids would be like sending videos of them twerking to my book. And it was really amazing. I got messages from Black immigrants, African immigrants, who just felt like they didn't really belong in the Latinx activist movement because of its politics that I haven't really aligned myself with. And they felt a little bit excluded from the Black Lives Matter movement. And they really found a home in my book. And I've gotten a lot of messages from like children of Asian immigrants who really love the book. I've gotten messages from disabled readers who have felt comfortable with the fact that so much of what makes someone documented, not documented, citizen, not citizen, smart, not smart, good at SATs, all of this is luck. and they understand the role that luck can play in a person's life, and the way that luck can determine whether or not you're discriminated against or not for the rest of your life. And I've had a lot of really successful Latinx children of immigrants understand my brain and share that with me. And also, I'm very open on Instagram about my mental illness and how hard work it is to stay high functioning and stable, and to how sometimes we judge whether or not we're doing okay with our mental health by how productive we are. But I also try to make sure that I find some space for joy every day. And I've had a huge response of Latinx kids being like, I am not doing well, and I want to work on my mental health, and that's meant the most to me.
So thank you for that. My last question before we get to the Q&A is just, what's the next thing? You teased it a little bit. Sounds like a novel. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe what, to focus on the art again, right? That shift from the undocumented Americans to the novel as a form. I'd love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, the novel, it's a young adult novel. And it's sort of loosely based on my teenage years in New York City, writing about music as a teenager, and like being in that underground, the undocumented underground, and the multiple undergrounds in New York. And it's like a very fast-paced, gritty, pre-gentrified New York book. If a beatnik was a queer, undocumented Jehovah's Witness girl in Brooklyn, who was rescued by a public masturbator by a drag queen before her Jehovah's Witness dad picked her up at midnight at a jazz club in the Village. Like, that's the novel. And then after that, I have a book of essays on cults.
Cults, theme, period. All right. Yes, Q&A. Let's go to the Q&A. The first question is, one attendee notes your interest in shifting the spotlight from the dreamer and onto the everyday undocumented immigrant. Can you say more about how we might continue these efforts on a nationwide political level?
I have no policy recommendations. I mean, I don't know. If you're genuinely interested, if you're like someone who works in policy spaces or like in activism spaces, you can contact Jose Antonio Vargas. He does that sort of how to get from hearts and minds to politics. I don't do that. Sorry.
Well, what you do is so important, is that you're giving people, they're going to be people, in 10, 15 years, probably even sooner. Like, I had my Karla stage where the undocumented Americans is really important for me, right? You're opening up a space for people to imagine these communities, right, in different ways, right? And I think that's perhaps not that's not a policy memo, but it is extremely important, as as people in the humanities at least like to think. I include myself among them. Okay, so more questions. Can you say more about the cover image of the book? This is from Laura Wexler.
Hi, Laura Wexler. Yes. So the updated cover image of the book is I have it here, so everyone can see it. It's this flower, and here are the USCIS documents, USCIS, which is being bankrupted intentionally, Stephen Miller brainchild. And then there are blood stains, which I requested to be all around there. And so I didn't have any control over why that flower was there. The flower was always there. And I was like, okay. I then came up with the explanation that it was like like I've always written about animals and wildlife in inhospitable places like the Sonoran Desert or under like the deepest fathoms of the sea, and compared undocumented people to that because we survive in inhospitable climates that want us dead, right? So I think that's what they derived inspiration from. And then I wanted the papers thing with the blood, because as someone who's gone through DACA, got a temporary green card that expired, I think a lot of people who've been undocumented and have experienced legalization, or who have been citizens and then had to petition their parents for legalization, and then now in this era has seen that fall through, all of that, there's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of survivor's guilt. There's a lot of guilt. And you always feel like you have blood on your hands. And I wanted to acknowledge the fact that, one, immigrants are world makers. We make worlds out of thin air. And two, the idea of papers, having papers is always in the background. But even when you have it, it never goes away. The trauma doesn't go away, and the feeling that you've left people behind doesn't go away.
So another question, what are the things you do for joy? How do you find joy when things feel harder than ever?
You know, what's a funny thing, well, Albert, you don't know this, but when I was Albert's grad student, I was like 23 or 24. I used to go to his office, clearly looking a mess. And Albert would like slide over a Ziploc bag of calming herbal tea to me, be like, I think you should take this home. And okay, so one of the things that I do now is I try to find like sensory things that I can look forward to every day. So one of the things is like showering and putting on like fragrant body lotions and body oils, because that's like a mindful thing that if you disassociate, which if you have trauma, you probably do in some way, it connects you to your body, and it also, you know, connects you to your senses. I also drink a lot of like turmeric tea. And it's kind of like a Pavlovian thing where like alcohol reminds me of like, I'm about to make a call to my dad and I need to calm down my nerves. But whereas like turmeric tea, a turmeric latte, which is just putting turmeric thing in like water and then putting some milk in it, it reminds me that I'm taking care of myself. So the more that I do it, the more it becomes a reminder to myself that I'm taking care of myself. I'm working on finding joy. I like birds. We should have talked more with Albert about birds. So I like feeding them. And I have this book by, what's Sibley's first name?
David.
David Sibley has a... So I read Sibley's books on birds when I'm feeling like super stressed and triggered, because birds are beautiful and resilient. So find something that's not immigration related, don't be like, okay, so I'm going to take care of myself, I'm going to read Audre Lorde. No, like find like birds. Before, when I used to be really crazy, I used to watch videos of grizzly bears. Just take humans out of the picture. Just look at a leaf, you know? I really recommend that.
I second the birds. And for those of you wondering what tea I was pushing in my office, it was tilo, which is in English linden flower. Right? Yeah, it's good calming tea. I drink a lot of it. That's why I was in my office. Another question. Can you say a bit more about your writing process, where and how you write, how you manage moments when the writing is not flowing?
Well, when I have like a lot of time, I'm like, I pretend that a lot of things matter, such as like inspiration. And I like, you know, ultimately, all of it is bullshit. And when you're on deadline, all that matters is like that you sit down and you write. So what helps is an outline. What helps the most is an outline. So I'm writing a piece for the New Yorker right now, and my editor made me an outline. And when I don't have someone making me an outline, my partner Talia makes me an outline. And when I had the book, what I did was I printed out chapters of the book, and I cut, I don't know if you know this, I cut out paragraphs, all the paragraphs, and sometimes individual sentences. And then I would tape them on my floor in the order in which they were meant by the gods to appear, which is actually the way Nabokov's wife organized his index cards, because he would write his book in index cards, and then she reorganized them in the way they were supposed to appear. Because I am not a linear thinker, and so outlines help a lot. Talia, my partner, is a fantastic teacher, and she makes all her students do outlines. So I would say, like, I believe in like burning Palo Santo, candles, skincare, moisturizing, doing my makeup, hair, like matcha, all of that, until like I'm on a deadline. And then I just like put on a one-piece bathing suit and just sit on my bed and just do it.
Well, this is a related question, because it's part of what makes your writing so distinctive is that your voice, right? Can you tell us more? This is a question. Can you tell us more about the process you've gone through to develop and refine your distinctive writerly voice?
Yeah, I think one of the things you first start doing is you start, first you discover things you don't like, voices you don't like. So Albert knows that I spent most of my time as a grad student being like, I hate this, I hate this. And then I would list everything that I hated. I wish I had spent more time finding out things that I liked. So at first, I think as a young writer, you write against things, and you shouldn't spend the rest of your career doing that, because some people do. Some people do just develop a voice that's just like anti things, but then they don't develop a voice of their own. I would say read a lot, but not only like novels or books, but like good TV writing. Like I was obsessed with 30 Rock. I watched it like 7 straight through. And that's like, there's like, I think there's a record number of references per minute. And like my writing is very reference heavy. So like that really inspired me. Like a lot, I watched a lot of SNL, that inspired me, a lot of rock and roll, that inspired me. Like anywhere that's good writing, like good writing can also be like, I remember when I was little, this is no longer the case, but when Vitamin Water first came out, the back copy of Vitamin Water used to be pretty witty. And I remember being like in the 5th grade and being like, I want to write for Vitamin Water one day. You know, like wherever you can find good writing, like not just books, but just let it inspire you. And that's where your voice is going to be like expansive. So that's why I tell kids, like, if you are like Latinx and you want to be a writer, don't just read like Ansaldúa, you know what I mean? Just don't read, just like read expansive, watch movies, but don't just watch like classics, watch everything, watch Paris is Burning, you know, like watch videos on how to Vogue and realize like what different storytelling looks like, you know, like watch big performances. I like watching big performances, like, yeah, Homecoming, Beyonce's Homecoming, like Freddie Mercury, like how is a good performance? How is like storytelling done? And I think that's how you pick up like a lot of like influences. And then when you sit down on the page, you can be you. But I'll tell you the truth, when I first started writing, I used to sit down and in order to get me hyped up to write, I used to be like, okay, such and such essay by Lori Moore, such and such essay by Joan Didion. And I used to try to imitate their voices. And I think that was a good exercise, because then you can see what like tics they have, what tricks they have. And so like I can do pretty good parodies of like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Joan Didion, Garcia Marquez, all of them. And like Gertrude Stein, who is a huge influence of mine, partly because I learned to parody her. So maybe like try to parody some of your favorite writers. And then, I don't know. I don't know. You should not take life advice from me, but that's the stuff that I did when I was younger.
I want to read the parodies of these of Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Stein. I want to read. It reminds me of Reinaldo Arenas does that for like the canon of Cuban writers in a book called La Loma del Ángel. So I would love to read Karla's version of this for the canon of American literature.
The Hemingway one is up on McSweeney's.
Is it? Have I seen it already? I've probably seen it. Oh, okay. More on that later. So the questions are, jumping around topics. That's fine. That's why we have a Q&A. So another question asks, can you talk about how you navigated these immigrant spaces from your interviews to your personal interactions as someone who is open and unapologetic about mental health and queerness?
And queerness?
Yes.
Okay, so this pixie is new and I didn't look like this when I went on my interviews, but I was open. So I'll be sincere. So first of all, for all of the day laborers, they had an organizer who is named Pedro in the book, who is gay and openly gay. And the way he organized them was to be like, if you are discriminated against, here are other groups who are discriminated against. In the Day Labor Worker Center, there are groups for LGBTQ people, there are groups for trans people. So they knew that they had to be respectful, and they all love him. It was a complete safe space for me. And I had like with all the people that I spoke to, and most of the people that I spoke to in my book were men, I had one experience, and it was with an American citizen, where I felt uncomfortable as a woman. And it was over text. It was, everyone was completely appropriate with me. And so I think that people really felt, something that helped was that I pitched them the book. So the pitch that I gave like the publishers to sell them was the pitch that I gave immigrants. I wanted them to understand why I was writing, because a lot of them had experiences with people from like Univision and Telemundo coming, taking their pictures, to getting interviews, and then like bouncing and then never seeing them again. And that's not what I wanted to do. Like, I still have some people that I love who are in these communities that I check in on them and make sure that they're doing okay during COVID, that they, that I want to make sure that they can count on me should things become catastrophic. And I didn't tell them that at the time, but I went into the communities and I was like, look, so my name's Karla. I am on DACA. I am a dreamer. I don't identify as a dreamer. Here's why I don't identify as a dreamer. My parents are undocumented. I have a complicated relationship with my parents. Here's why. I was like, this is the book I want to write. Here's why books that I have written about migrants that I've read, I feel fall short. Here's why I think we have not been represented in a way that I'd like to see us represented. Here's why I think I can do that differently. Do you trust me to try? And I felt like it would have been condescending for me to just be like, hey, can I interview about your life, without telling them what I was trying to do with their stories. And they responded really well to that. They were like, yeah, people think we're alcoholics. Yeah, people. And I think like in one of my chapters where it's like middle-aged women who are like, yeah, we're tired of our husbands we married too young. Like, I'm having like a feminist awakening now and I want to go party. Like, that would not have been possible if I had not told them that I was trying to change stereotypes and caricatures of immigrants. They would have just been like, yes, so we are activists. They would have told me the story they thought I was trying to get. And so one was that. Another thing is that like my Spanish is a very formal, like church Spanish, mom and dad Spanish. So I reminded them of their kids and grandkids. And during the writing of the book, I had like pink hair, purple hair, green hair, and I had these tattoos. And some of them would be like, you have a lot of tattoos. What do your parents think about that? And I was like, what do you think my parents think about that? And, it just became like, I was myself around them. And I just reminded them of their kids and grandkids who assimilated and who they were just shaking their heads at, you know? It was, I looked like them. I had their same status. Like the Yale thing didn't mean anything to them. They were proud of it. Some of them had never heard of the school. And they were like, they knew that I worried that I worked hard in order so that I could be able to help my parents out financially. And that meant a lot to them. The gay stuff, I didn't volunteer it. But I talked about my partner. It helps that pronouns don't often come up in Spanish, but I would be like, oh yes, I have to go to my partner and blah, blah, blah. If someone I felt was extremely religious, I would say partner and repeat partner and avoid pronouns. But most people I was just open with, because I felt like if they were uncomfortable with me being queer and being this, like we wouldn't have the level of intimacy required to form the story that we needed to form together. And I could just find another subject.
So last question, oldie but a goodie, important given the population, the imagined population audience for this conversation is, what advice do you have for aspiring Latinx writers? And if you want to just wrap up into any of that, any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
I would say read a lot. I would say don't listen to what Hollywood representations of Latinx people have to say about our own representation. They're not leading the way here. I think we're in a really interesting moment where immigrant artists and Latinx artists are trying to do really cool things with voice and genre. Like, I don't know if y'all have read Marcelo Hernandez Castillo's Children of the Land. He's an undocumented author, I think on his way to permanent residency or something. But he's a poet and he wrote a really cool book. Jenny Zhang was never undocumented, but she grew up in Queens, grew up as an immigrant, and her book is vulgar and filthy and wacky and crazy. And you know, Salvador Plasencia's People of Paper, which I learned from Albert, is you know, great book. I would say kill your idols, you know, commit matricide and patricide. Like, stop looking at Julia Alvarez and Sandra Cisneros and, you know, all those ladies and stop looking at Gloria Anzaldúa and all of that. Like, it's past that. It's 2020. Like, start looking elsewhere for inspiration. Like, there are some books that I'm reading that are coming out now that are still describing our skin as like dulce de leche skin, and are still saying that our parents are strong and can handle anything, and that they just like pray to the Virgen and everything will be okay. And that is tired, and it's this like incestuous relationship that the publishing industry has with Hollywood. And that is what has created the backdrop for what we think we need to sound like. And we don't. And you will receive pushback for not sounding like that. But our canon is young. But we need to push forward, because this is like such an important time to really experiment and to really support each other as we create some, you know, really powerful art. Because if we're creating art where if you like take a person who's like been in a bunker for 50 years and is like, was this produced in the 90s or was this produced in 2020? And if they can't tell the difference, like, you writing it was a waste of time.
Well said. Well, that's the time we have today. MJ, were you going to jump on for any closing thoughts? I mean, I'm happy. Thank you, Karla, obviously, for taking the time to chat. Thanks everyone for logging on for the conversation. MJ, you want to take the mic here?
Just want to thank you both so much. It was an amazing event. For our audiences, thank you for joining us. I am linking our social media on the chat. Please follow us. There will be many more events to come. Keep in touch. So thank you all.
Thanks for coming.
Take care, everyone.